Every year, Wisdom of the Elders is when we gather three of folks who've gone before us just a little bit and paved the way for what we are able to do and what we enjoy. This year, I'm honored to have at the far left Patrick Sky, whose career bridges everything from Greenwich Village in the 60s to uilleann pipe making and book publishing in more recent years, and his lovely wife Kathy there with him, who was the second employee of Folk Alliance International after me. I hired her, I reckon, in 1993, 1994, along in there, when the office was in the Southern Folklife Collection in Chapel Hill in my days as ED. Then in the middle, Reggie Harris, who gave such a powerful showcase last night. He's a little bit young for being an elder, but I figured since he was supposed to die 9 years ago, that's got to count for something.
Put it right out there.
Well, heck, I died 14 years ago, and it's been the best 14 years of my life since then.
I'm with you.
And then closest to me here is Doug Orr, the President Emeritus of our neighbor in Warren Wilson College and founder of Swannanoa Gathering. Our format this year, and I did somehow convince the organizers to give us 15 more minutes. I don't know how I worked that, but we'll start off with self-introductions by our panelists. Then I'll pose probing queries for about a quarter of an hour. Then we'll have each panelist pose a question of one of the other two, and then open it up to your questions to finish off our 90 minutes. So let's start with Doug here on the self-introduction.
Thank you, Art. And most of all, thank you and your colleagues for all the hard work that goes into this. Being affiliated with the Swannanoa Gathering and working with the college all those years, I have some inkling of all that goes behind the scenes. We see the tip of the iceberg, so thank you and your colleagues so much. And it certainly is an honor to be up here with Reggie and Pat. Pat, you probably don't remember, but back in the 80s when I was president of the Charlotte Folk Society, we had you and Kathy, and Lord, the road you've taken and the turns it's taken over the years is so impressive. Reggie is a regular at our Swannanoa Gathering, including this summer during Traditional Song Week, and I got to tell you, his moniker often is the Pied Piper of the Swannanoa Gathering. Those of you who were here last night saw what he can do to liven up and lift the voices in a room. He just has that magic about him. And he and Kim have been our house guests in Black Mountain. He's got a guest bedroom invitation anytime he comes back through, which I hope will be often. So it's a pleasure and honor to be with these two road warriors, kindred spirits, and great musicians. You have to be a little careful about the wisdom of the elders because the memory of the elders is not always just right there. And it reminds me of what's becoming more and more a favorite saying of ours, and that is, some of my best memories are things that never happened at all. And so it is with the memories of the elders. I quickly summarize a journey that's included music at its core in many ways. I was a 60s folkie, was in graduate school at Chapel Hill, and you can imagine Chapel Hill in the 60s, a lively place, and we were involved in just about every protest movement one could guess, but all the music that came through was great as well. And I particularly learned or had deepened for me the understanding of the power of song for social change and social justice. And along the way I also understood that just raising your voice was not enough. You needed to raise your voice in the community of song. And I'm reminded of the quotation by the great Spanish cellist, the late Pablo Casals, who said, music must have a purpose beyond just itself. It must connect us to our humanity. And translated, I think that means that we're in the midst of communities. And we live in a fractured world and certainly a country, to say the least, of divisiveness, and a digital age and a loss of community. And in many ways, music can be that vehicle to bring us back together. My personal journey beyond Chapel Hill has been really on the wings of song. I met Darcy, my wife, in a folk music jam at Central Piedmont Community College in Charlotte. We wound up being in a band together, and later a couple. And we tell people that if you can survive in a band together, you can probably survive in a marriage, right? I was by default the kind of the leader of the band. That was a harder job than being college president, believe me. But our journey took us to, of course, Warren Wilson College. And without telling Darcy, when I was nominated for the position, I drove up quietly to this bucolic setting down the road, pulled into the middle of the campus, right at the heart of where the Swananoa Gathering is. And some of you have been there, right where the beer tent is and the view of the mountains. And my first thought was not about being an administrator. It was about what a great place for a music camp. And it was, and it is, as well. I found also very quickly that music is a tie that binds and also reduces barriers when sometimes your title gets in the way of relating to students or faculty or whomever. So we had a lot of music in our days there. We started a music jam. When we'd have events at the President's Home, we would end it with a bit of song. I remember Lenny Sitnick, the mayor of the time, said at the end of the evening, she said, she grew up in a Jewish family and said, we haven't done this since I was a kid in New York, and we'd gather around the piano, and we need more of this. Whenever we'd go on the road for the college, the Development Alumni Office would insist that we take our musical instruments, because they found out quickly, as we did, that after I gave my 20-minute commercial for the college, we'd lead a few songs, and 6 months later they wouldn't remember a word I said, but they remembered that we sang together. Another example of the community of song. And I think at the end of each week of the Swananoa Gathering, and I still serve as the college host for the gathering, folks leave and have a hard time pulling away, and Reggie can attest to this, because yeah, they've learned some skills, they've learned some new songs, they've learned guitar licks, but most of all, they have been part of a community of kindred spirits. As someone said to me one time, this is my tribe, and whatever the age, whatever the background might be. I want to share with you a quotation from our book, The Swananoa Gathering, before passing it on to Reggie. This comes from Northern Ireland, or what was the old Ulster, and a great colleague of ours who teaches in the gathering, Lynn Graham, wrote a book about Joe Holmes, a great Irish fiddler and folklorist, about community and the gathering of music. Over there they call it, of course, the Céilís, the gatherings. In Lynn's book that we quoted in Wayfaring Strangers, this sort of community gathering with song, story, and dance was common to many houses and places in County Antrim and other parts of Ulster, irrespective of economic and religious background. The subculture of the Céilí house, which was a scene of fireside philosophers, rustic bards, storytellers, balladeers, traditional musicians, and dancers, was that of ordinary people doing extraordinary things with great creativity. The Joe Holmes hearth and homestead was a welcome oasis, bringing together neighbors, tinkers, itinerant musicians, and songsters in a sense of great community and Céilíing, as they called it. One of the great leaders of that, as I know, Art, is Reggie. Can I turn it over to him? Mr. Music Man.
Well, as always, Doug Orr is a font of wisdom, and certainly one of my elders, and one of the people who changed my life. And I think, as I see myself on this panel this morning, being the younger of the set, and I'm honored to be here for a variety of reasons, but I'm honored to be here because my friend Sunny Oaks did start this, and when she was putting the idea together, we had several conversations about it. And what she said was, she really wanted to bring the substance of the folk community, the institution, the connection to the past that so often gets lost. And for the first one, we brainstormed a few people, and then she went off and she began to add people in, and it has been picked up over the years, and it's been a beautiful thing to watch. I think my connection to this for its entirety has been that I was born into a community of elders that were just so prominent in my life before a time, as a young person, before I really knew of the power of their presence. I often joke that my mother made sure that we were at our church, Nazarene Baptist Church, at Nice and Lycoming Street in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Every opportunity that there was. The church doors were open and she felt we needed to be there. And my vision of that was that she was trying to pass this great faith of hers on to me. And she was. But largely, she was putting me into a community of elders, which is a long-standing, well, it's a human thing, you know, in so many communities, and particularly the African-American community, where from the very time that we landed on these shores in America, you needed to be connected to the African homeland in a way that couldn't really exactly exist because the crossing of the ocean was such a major severing of that connection. People in Africa from various tribes came here and they had to become a people apart from the very land on which they stood, in which they had their primal spiritual connection. So here was a whole new framework of creating tradition, culture, and history. And so while I read a book years ago by a man who's not related to me, but Eddie L. Harris, and he went to Africa and he traveled for a year, and within a week he said, I understand that I have African roots, but I'm not an African. I'm an African American. So sitting in that community of elders as I grew up, I was absorbing things that at the time I didn't really understand and I didn't know were really being absorbed. But my mother was very steadfast in making sure I was there. And it would be years before I would actually begin to get an inkling of why that was important and to make that connection. And the connection came, of course, through song. So I begin this morning by honoring that in this way. There's a song that I have sung probably, I would say, conservative estimate, 10,000 times in my life. I've sung it at least 5-6 times every single week that I've been a performer. And I sing it because it's part of that heritage, it's part of that connection to the elders. The song is Wade in the Water. I deeply resisted the opportunity that came in 1981, 82 to do a program on the Underground Railroad. And I deeply resisted it because it wasn't on my agenda. I was on track after having seen people like Peter, Paul, and Mary, and James Taylor, and Cat Stevens, and Richie Havens. I was on track to become rich and famous. I didn't really term it that way, but the approach was that Kim and I had begun to perform and we began to see these people out there, and what we were focusing on was the fact that they were known worldwide. And so, as most young people, I looked at that and I said, well, that's what I want. Singing is fun, but I want to be known worldwide. But it was a self-importance. It was the focus on self, making myself well known. That was not a fabric of my community growing up. We sang together because it connected us. As Bernice Johnson Reagan says, singing changes the air. We sing together and we breathe together and we conspire together. And so, embarked on that particular career path, this little opportunity from the Philadelphia Folk Song Society rose up. And it was an opportunity to go into schools and to do a short program on something that folk music did in history. And Kim actually remembered a little program that came into her school when she was in 4th grade, and a guy stood up and talked about the African-American diaspora and the songs and how they were secret codes. And she said, I think it was the spirituals. And we said, okay, well, let's look at those. And we, of course, both had grown up in our church singing some of them. So we began to look at that program, and we put together literally a half hour and 2 or 3 songs. Wade in the Water was one of them. I had no idea. We went into 5 schools that week, and it changed my life. We sang that song, and the fact that the code allowed people to remember what they needed to remember to make the journey to freedom. Walk through the water, cover your scent. Keep your scent away from the slave catchers. Water as life, water as human connection, keeping you from being dehydrated. Water as directional finder. All of those things were what the ancestors gave us in song. And so singing that song, every time I sing that song, I reconnect to those folks who sat in Nazarene Baptist Church and sang that song and the other spirituals, as Frederick Douglass, who now, of course, has a brand new life. You just never know when people are going to come back with power. You know? Frederick Douglass said, "The songs of the slave are the sorrows of their hearts, but we are eased by them." But he also said, "When you hear us sing of Canaan, O Canaan, I'm bound for Canaan land, you also know that we are on our way to freedom." And so as I sing these songs and I tell these stories, we as human beings being hardwired for story and song, I feel the connection, and I feel, well, I begin now to feel like an elder. Because the translated wisdom and information and education and inspiration that comes from those stories. And as I say, I reluctantly embraced the mission, but I had an occasion, Dr. Charles Blockson in Philadelphia, another of my elders, donated his collection of African American memorabilia to Temple University, where I went to school. And as fortune would have it, I managed to come into a meeting with him. Kim and I went to see him early in our Underground Railroad career. And he said, "This is a wonderful thing that you're embarking on, but I don't know that you fully grasp the importance of it." He said, "I don't know what your plans are, but this is going to take over your life." And we looked at each other and we said, yeah, right. I would say it hasn't necessarily taken over my life. It has informed my life. It has imbued my life as a storyteller, as a musician, as an artist, as a citizen, as a man, as a human being, as a transplant survivor, with a focus that allows me to get out of the way of the mission and to take in the accumulated knowledge and wisdom that is available to pass on. So as I go from place to place, I feel really deeply blessed to be an elder. And not so much in the sense of being older, although my body tells me every day that's true, but in the sense that what now comes out of my mouth has less to do with what I think and more to do with the power of community and I think the power of accumulated, it's a spiritual connection that is not of religious origin. And so I say in this way, Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Didn't my Lord? Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Didn't my Lord? Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Didn't my Lord? Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Well, didn't my Lord deliver Daniel when they threw him in the lion's den? Well, he sat with those boys in the fiery furnace till they could get cool again. He delivered the people there by the sea, Jonah from the belly of the whale. Well, when my people heard those stories, they said, there ain't no way we're gonna fail. We will wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. You gotta wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Well, if you don't believe, you can be set free now. Free in the water. Well, now it's up to you and it's up to me. Say, wade in the water. You gotta wade in the water. You better wade in the water, children. Wade. God's gonna trouble the water.
All right, your turn, Pat.
To be honest with you, this is the first time I've ever done one of these or even been here. So I'm not a very good monologuist, but I am a pretty good elder. So maybe what I'll do is just list all the things that I've done, because I've done so many things. Musically, I started out with, I was about 3 years old. My grandmother used to rock me in the rocking chair and sing Barbara Allen. And by the time I was 4, if she missed a verse, I'd get mad and pitch a tantrum. And this sort of drove her nuts. She's wanting to relax, and I want to hear Barbara Allen again. So that's my first memory of getting into folk music. I didn't know it was folk music at the time. It was just music that our family did. That version, let me see, when did I do that? I lost my train of thought.
That version, how many verses did it have?
Oh, that's right. It had something like, that version she did had 20 or 30 verses. It's like, it just went on and on and on and on. And the next memory I have is I had an uncle. We called him an uncle, he wasn't, but he was a banjo player, and I was freaked out the first time I heard a banjo. I thought that was really something, and so I started playing around with the banjo, and then I had a cousin who had a Georgia string band, and they had a big dance hall there, and one time he took me there and called me up to the stage and told me to sing a song, and I didn't know what to sing, and then I wound up singing The Wreck of the Old 97, and I was about 5 years old when I did this, and that was he gave me $1, so that was my very first professional gig. So the music thing, it just sort of happened. I never decided anything that I was going to do. I just sort of followed my nose, and I can jump from the time we were living in Louisiana. I ran away from home when I was 15 years old, and I joined the Army. I lied to them and told them that I was 17. and I got a friend of mine's mother to go down and sign it and say she was my mother. So I stupidly joined the Army. I was at that for a while, and this was during the Korean era, so I thought they were going to send me to Korea, but what happened, the Korean War stopped. It was all over, and they called me in and said, "Do you want out?" And I said, "I guess so." Then I had to move on to something next, and I guess that's about the time I started playing folk music, and I got a guitar and living in Atlanta, and I had a gig playing at a pizza parlor. I used to do that. That was a tasty gig, as they say. Anyway, I was just always interested in early folk music. Some of the earliest I remember was the Weavers were on television. And, I couldn't believe that. And I sort of drifted into liking folk music and finally moved into the 60s, and I started performing at different clubs and being on the 60s circuit. And back then it was two things that I thought were really great. One of them was that there was a series of coffee houses. People forget we used to drink coffee a lot. But anyway, there were a series. You could start performing in Boston, then you could go to Connecticut, you could go to New York and Chicago, and you just go right on out to California, never stopping. There were just places to play all over the place. And
Extended engagements.
oh yeah, that's what I was trying to say. The other thing that was good back then is you didn't get hired for one night. They usually hired you from, depending on the club, either for a week or 2 weeks. And that had a huge advantage if you had any records or anything like that and you wanted to promote or you wanted to do interviews. It was easy to get it done because take an interviewer, maybe they couldn't come to see you Monday, but they could do it on Wednesday. So it was real easy to promote yourself. And it seems to me, just looking around, it's much harder. You know, it's easier in terms of computers and all that. But anyway, during the 60s, I was hanging out in Florida, and I met Buffy St. Marie, and we came north together to New York, and I sort of made New York my southern home away from home. Got me an apartment in New York, and I started living there. And the whole music scene was wide open. Mostly the Gaslight and the Village Gate and the Kettle of Fish actually is a bar. And that bar, in my opinion, was the main point of singing there. The bar, like everybody met there. I mean, any given day you just go in, sit in there and wait, and somebody would come along. People like Phil Oakes and Grambling Jack Elliott and Richie Havens, who passed away here recently. Anyway, the other thing that I liked about it was I got to meet some of the most fantastic people and work with them, like Mississippi John Hurt and Lightning Hopkins and the Bluesville, and then the country thing. I really love the New Lost City Ramblers, and they had a big effect on my music. And I'm trying to think what happened next. But
Philly Festival.
oh yeah, I kind of switched music. That's what it was. I got interested in Irish music. I was playing at the Philly Festival, and I met this piper named Liam O'Flynn, and it's the first time I had ever heard uilleann pipes. So I hired him and took him on the road with me and used him as an opening act, and he just went over fantastic. And went back to Ireland and formed a group called Planksty, which was just the first early music that I was exposed to in Ireland. And I keep going. I went to Ireland and opened a penny whistle business. It just it blew itself out, I guess. What else did I do? I opened a candle business once, and people kept stealing my candles. I had this store that would sell my candles. I'd take them in there, and people would steal them. They weren't expensive either, a couple of dollars. And I got really pissed off, and I went and bought some of these great big firecrackers, and I made them. And I put the firecracker in the candle. And I could just imagine some guy and his girlfriend in the back seat of their car lighting their candle at both ends, probably. Anyway, that's what else did I do?
And Srig.
Oh yeah, then I forgot. I met a woman named Lisa Null, and together we formed Green Linnet Records. And it was originally called Leviathan Records, and we changed our mind, and we thought that Green Linnet sounded better. So I sort of moved over and went to Ireland, and I got to know a lot of the people over there too, and the elders again, Seamus Ennis and Willie Clancy and Tommy Reck, and gosh, just make a list. Anyway, I sort of gave up performing around 1976 or 77. I got tired of being on the road, so I started making pipes because there were none around. At the time that Liam O'Flynn came over, I got my set of pipes by going from bar to bar and asking if anybody knew where I could find a set of pipes. And I actually stumbled across a set of pipes in New York. The woman said she would only sell them to somebody that could play them, and she wanted $300. And I sent Liam in there, and he sat down and played. Got the pipes, $300, and those pipes today are probably worth $10,000 or $15,000. Anyway, so I got into Irish music that way, and then I went back to college and got a degree in folklore because I wanted to get rich. It didn't turn out quite like that. I did get to work in the archive, though, for quite a period of time. And I'm running out of things that I did. Never did learn roller derby. I always wanted to do that. I met Mississippi John Hurt at one of the Philadelphia folk festivals. And then a few years went by and he was signed up by Vanguard. And we had become friends, and every time he'd come to New York, he'd stay at my apartment. And I got to know him real well. And Vanguard was wanting to make a recording of him. And so I took him up to the Vanguard studios, and it was full of agents and all these people in there. And poor John was just sort of sitting in the back holding his guitar, and all these people were talking and arguing over and all this. And so I went to Maynard Solomon, who's the owner of Vanguard, and I said, "Do you want to get a good record out of John?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, make me the producer." He said, "All right, you're the producer." I stood up. I just stood up on a chair, and I said, "I want everybody to get the hell out of here." And I ran them all off until those first recordings were just myself and John Hurt and a bottle of whiskey. And he just relaxed and produced those recordings, which I think are amazing to this day.
Well, I'd like to say a belated thank you to you for your graciousness. I think we opened for you at Godfrey Daniels.
Godfrey Daniels.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might have. I remember some other thing in the park with the two of you.
Yeah, we had two dates with you.
Was it in a park?
In Philly?
Yeah.
Yeah, there were these folks who were putting together a thing in Fairmount Park.
Oh,
And
maybe that's what it was.
yeah, it was a summer series. And
Or maybe Pittsburgh, too.
oh, I don't know that one.
Okay.
Maybe I am an elder.
You're having an elder moment.
Well, I just, again, it was very early in our career, and we'd had a couple of opening dates where people had not been so gracious. But those were very formative things. It has also, there are not as many concerts where they do openers these days. But whenever I'm asked, I say yes, largely because of people like you. So,
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I should mention that Dave Wilkes was booking Patrick back in the day, and I think most of you got to know Dave through SERFA or through the International. It always sort of follows from what Patrick was saying and what Reggie just said, that I see a connection to both Reggie and Doug with Patrick sort of as the connective tissue, the gristle as it were, since both the singer-songwriter side with Reggie and then the Celtic music side with Doug. And 30 years ago or so, I was subletting a little trailer here south of I-40, and it got down to 16 degrees below zero. I remember one night in the coldest snap ever to hit North Carolina. But I was listening to the radio. I could just pick up 90.7 out of Charlotte, North Carolina, WFAE, and I heard a woman playing Celtic music on the radio, and I was amazed to find that, and it turned out her name was Fiona Ritchie, and she was doing a show called Thistle and Shamrock that since became a national program. And I think Doug, in many ways, is best known for introducing Fiona to Louise's restaurant down here in Black Mountain. But tell us how you and Fiona came to conceive the book that became Wayfaring Strangers.
Fiona and I first met in 1981. How about that for elders? She was an exchange student at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where I was a vice chancellor. And during that time, she asked if she could volunteer at our very new public radio station, WFAE, and she did. And then after graduating from Stirling University in Scotland, she came back again, and we hired her as development director. And one day she came into my office and said, what do you think about my starting a local program of Celtic music? And I said, Fiona, I'm an old folkie, go for it. Scotch-Irish descent. The station manager said, well, Fiona, we'll give it a try, but with that accent, you'll never make it in public radio. Well, we went national in 1983, and the rest is history. But through all those years, I was struck by the fact that here was an individual, not only with a great ear for the music and a wonderful voice. Some of her fan mail would say, Fiona just talked for an hour. Or a marriage proposal for a fellow in the Tijuana jail. I mean, it goes on and on. But I also began to sense that here was someone who wrote as beautifully as she spoke. And Art, it was at the 2004 National Folk Fest on the National Mall, on the Smithsonian Folk Fest, where the themes were Scotland, Appalachia, and Mali. She was pregnant with little Finley, with Ailey, I mean, her first child, and no, with Finley. And we, under a shade tree, started talking about, we need to write this down before it gets lost. We know so many individuals we could interview that could be our voices of tradition, ranging from Pete Seeger to Gene Redpath to Gene Ritchie to Doc Watson, and so it goes. So at that time, we hatched the idea, Art, that we would do a book, and we would interview as many voices of tradition as possible. When Finley was 10 years old, the book was published. It takes a while, doesn't it? And, but that meant Darcy and I had to go to Scotland many times and Ireland for research. Somebody had to do that, and we were up to it. Darcy is the art editor for the book, collected 135 images. And it's been a joy because of the people we've met, the voices we've preserved. 6 of the individuals interviewed are no longer living. Pete and Mike Seeger, Gene Ritchie, Doc Watson, Joe Thompson, Gene Redpath, and so we're reminded, Art, that it's so important to capture these voices now. Whether it's in your family or simply a performing musician or a legend like Pete Seeger. We spent a full day at his house up above the Hudson and just let him go at it. And if you want to turn that into an award-winning program, The Wisdom of Pete Seeger. Now there's the wisdom of the elders for you. So that's a kind of a extensive background. There are many other turns along the way because like the story of this music and its immigration, it's not linear, and neither was our preparation for the book.
What were the couple of the biggest surprises that you learned in the research for Wayfaring Strangers?
Well, one of them was, and we say this many, many times, that our book started off to be 235 pages through our publisher, the University of North Carolina Press. It came in at 385. And the reason for that is that we discovered fairly quickly something we intuitively knew, and that is, while the basic soundtrack, the initial soundtrack of the Appalachian music is Scotch-Irish, that it's a tapestry, and we use that word, and that is a subtitle, a tapestry of music. And that is, there are influences from the Germans, the Welsh, the French, the English, the Irish, the Cherokee, and most notably and underestimated, the influence of the African Americans. I didn't know that at the time of the Revolutionary War, half the fiddle players in the South were African American. We know the origin of the banjo, of course, but there are the field songs, the call and response, the spirituals, the hush lullabies, the string bands that were all African American. So it's a layered, rich tapestry, and that was not a surprise, but perhaps a deepening understanding for us, and we spent a lot of time on that piece of it. We also were struck by the fact that it was not a linear migration. It was an oral tradition and had many different curves along the way. We were reminded of the great community of the music. And finally, that the immigration of the Scotch-Irish, 250,000 in the 18th century, and others to come, is a universal story. The immigration of the forced slave trade. There's so many stories there, and the relevance today of the immigration story, where among the Scotch-Irish, all of their earthly belongings were in a trunk, but more important was what was in their heart and their voices, the memories, the songs, the fiddle tunes, the heartbreak, that tension between wanderlust and homesickness. And Lord knows we need to be reminded of that today as immigration is distorted and is, of course, a major issue. We are all immigrants.
That tapestry is so important to stress, since people like Cecil Sharp, who came to the mountains in 1916, and then Henry Ford, who fortunately didn't run for president but had a heck of a lot of similarities with our current president, were caught up in nativism and misappropriated this music to spread their nativist message and the pure Anglo-Saxon preservation of the music of the centuries and the child ballads here in the mountains. But one thing that crosses between you and Patrick are pipes. And the pipes in Scotland, the Highland pipes, are so different from the Uilleann pipes that Patrick makes and plays. I'd like for the two of you to give us a little lesson about the difference in the two pipes, which to me are as different as old time and bluegrass.
Well, Pat would be the expert, but let me start by saying the Irish like to say that they introduced the pipes to Scotland. And that's partly true. The pipes came originally from ancient Samaria, most likely, and came in from a lot of places, but also Ireland. And of course, the Irish are the smaller pipes. But the Irish go on to say they meant it as a joke on the Scots, and the Scots haven't discovered the humor in it. And the Highland pipes, the big pipes you blow into, are very definitely an outdoor instrument, but very different from the sweet sound of the small pipes, Irish pipes that Pat has produced. So here's the expert at the end of the table about the pipes, and there are, of course, a lot of legends about it. But the pipes were not an Appalachian instrument. They didn't come over on the boat. It was just too cumbersome, too expensive. It was a later time during the Revolution when they became over as part of the Revolutionary Army. Pat, I'd also be interested how you got into that business.
Like I said, I had hired the piper to go with me, and it sort of went from there. I noticed that there were none to play. I had a heck of a time finding my set of pipes, so I started making practice sets. So myself and David Quinn was another one. The two of us sort of started making pipes here in the United States. I did want to say too about the pipes that Ambrose Bierce, I think it was, that said on hearing them, "Thank God there's no smell." So if you want to make friends, you can't be a piper, I think.
I think there are many pipe jokes.
Anyway.
Many pipe jokes as there are banjo jokes, aren't there, Pat?
Yeah. The big difference in the Irish pipes is, one is their bellows blown. You have a bellows under one arm, and it blows air by way of a tube into a bag on the other arm, and then there's another tube that comes out and connects to the part that you play called the chanter. And the biggest advantage musically is that the Irish pipes can play 2 full octaves, where the Scots pipes can only play 9 notes. So that really limits the kind of music that they can play. And they're used mostly today. The uilleann pipes are used as dance music. That's what's happened with them. And you can play the reels and the jigs and the hornpipes and all of that on the Irish pipes. So that's about them, I think. Any question?
Yeah, before we get away from rigs and jigs and hornpipes, I should mention that Kathy Sky is a wonderful Irish fiddler and very serious student of Irish fiddling. Patrick, like Doug, has produced an important book. How did you come to write a manual of Irish uilleann piping?
I just saw that there was a need, and the first thing I did was I wrote a little, I wouldn't call it a book, a pamphlet. It's about 40, 50 pages long, on how to make reeds. And the one thing that you can count on is if you're in a situation where they have other pipers, all the pipers do is they sit around and they talk about reeds and how to get them going and how to stop them from squeaking and how to do this, and how it goes on and on and on. So I realized that there was a need for people to learn to make their own reeds, such as clarinet players, because our Irish reeds takes, from time to start making a reed to finish, it takes about an hour and 40 minutes. It takes a long time, and they're expensive because you put in a lot of time to them, and plus you can't guarantee them. You can put all that work in and they won't play, so you have to start over again. And these are the agonies of pipers. So.
Well, you talked to Reggie very eloquently about the effect that the Underground Railroad project had on your life and career. And one thing that I think you and Kim have done beautifully is to be able to teach those kind of historical lessons through performance without sounding pedantic. And what have you learned about being able to achieve that?
I think first off, perhaps it's the way we came at it. I was fascinated by the fact that I didn't know anything about it. When I grew up, the Underground Railroad was largely considered a myth. And of course, it was early in African American historical studies. There weren't any programs really that we knew about where information about the slave narratives and the music were being taught. I think Dr. Charles Blockson was one of the first that we came in contact with. Their, and at that time, it was really from a passion standpoint, but I came to it as a performer. So gaining this information, the little that we were able to accrue, we had to make it interesting. The first performances were for kids. So, as I often say, kids are more than happy to entertain themselves. If you're not going to be interesting, they will move on. So, we had this, five shows, and then we got other shows, and then suddenly we're there. And so how do you make that interesting? Well, you tell stories, and then you blend the songs, and you teach them to sing. And then so we went on that path for a while, and it was beginning to grow, and I just couldn't learn enough about it. We started to read, and we were traveling already, so we began to visit sites of the Underground Railroad. Dr. Blockson was very helpful. He just gave us all these sites. He said, "Where are you going?" So we'd go, and we would talk to historians, and we would, talk to elders, to people who, and even in that time, this is 1981, 82, and people were still reluctant to talk about it, in many cases. They felt that this was a heritage, and in some cases, folks in the black community didn't want to talk to white people about it, and so this was going, and then we somehow managed to get booked for a week of performances at the Kennedy Center. By this time, we'd been performing all over the country with this, and so the Kennedy Center was bringing us in to do a week of performances at the Terrace Theater, and on an afternoon about a month before, the phone rang, and I picked up the phone, and it was a woman named Lynn Silverstein, and she said, "I understand you're coming to the Kennedy Center to do these performances on the Underground Railroad." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, while you're here, if you have an afternoon, I'd like you to do, if you're willing, a workshop for teachers." And in my head, I thought, oh, we come in and we sing some of the songs, and we talk about the stories and entertain the teachers for, a couple hours. And she didn't explain anything further. So I said, "Yeah, well, we can do that." And we picked an afternoon. And she said, "Great, I'll be back to you." And a couple days later, she called and she said, "Could you send me an outline of what you would do?" And I said, "Fine." So Kim and I sat down and we prepared an outline and we sent it off. And about a week later, she called again and she said, "This is a wonderful outline. And I think the teachers will be very interested. I'd like to look at 1 and 2 of your outline." And what she proceeded to do over the course of the next 4 weeks was give us an education in how curriculum connections between artists and teachers could be made. We didn't realize at the time, but this was the start of the Kennedy Center's Changing Education Through the Arts program. And we were one of 7 artists that they had picked to bring into the program. So she wore us out. I was actually, for a period of 8 days, we were on the Clearwater, sailing on the Hudson, doing environmental education, concerts at night with Pete Seeger and, and various other musicians. And every time we got off the boat to get a shower and checked our phone machine, there was a message from Lynn Silverstein with some other things she wanted us to look at. So that was a program we became part of, and from that, other things grew. But my passion for that became that everywhere we went, no one knew. And it wasn't just the African-American story. It was how that story connected to the rest of America. And we said it's misnamed. It's not African-American history. It's really American history. It's all of our history. So the connective piece for me is that I was, my schooling in Philadelphia by junior high school, when I was, my mother decided that to push us out. So any opportunity she had to send us to a school out of the neighborhood, she embraced, which put me into relationship with other cultures and other religions and other communities in Philadelphia. And in my 8th grade year, my history teacher, who was also my homeroom teacher, said to my mother one night, "Reginald's kind of an unusual kid." And she said, "How so?" He said, "Well, I just think now what he knew was that I was going to, after 9th grade, I was going to go back to a high school in my section of Philadelphia, North Philly, predominantly black, and a troubled school. And he, taking that information, I don't know where he even got it, But he saw that I was going to have a lot of trouble there because I had other interests. I wasn't just a kid who was listening to Motown or, I was I was very eclectic. He saw that in me, which is another thing, another reason why I've been so passionate about connecting with teachers, because the importance of connecting teachers to the importance of history and culture and seeing in their students how that connects is really important in shaping our world view, our perspective. So he saw that. He asked her if she would be willing for him to get me into the high school that was the feeder high school for that junior high school. That was about 3 neighborhoods further away from my home. It was that connection that connected me to the high school music teacher that embraced my love of classical music, of jazz, and of choral music. And of course, the spirituals after the Civil War were embraced by folks at the black colleges, and then of course in an effort to legitimize the spirituals, the composers, African American composers began to do arranged spirituals. So there was this huge repertoire of material that I then began to sing and became aware of. So with the Kennedy Center, we went in with this newly formed teacher workshop, and we were able to connect with these teachers in a way that prior to that, I had no idea. I certainly didn't want to be a teacher. I left college because I knew I didn't want to be an English teacher. And now we're playing music all the time. It was not in my perspective to go back into the schools. But suddenly I found myself there all the time.
You were telling me a while back about a really moving personal experience where you kindly went backwards on the Underground Railroad and went back to the place where your ancestors had been enslaved and then met the ancestor of the slave owner.
Yeah, well, my one of my relatives was inspired by roots, and so she decided, she was living in Richmond, Virginia. It was one of the cousins I met at one of the family reunions, and she was a real character. She's since passed. But Kay decided that she was going to do the family genealogy. And she, of course, was doing this before the internet. So she had to dig into the county records and travel around and get stories. So in 1992, and it's really funny because this connects to my time at Swananoa. In 1992, we had a family reunion, and Kay had asked for a couple of hours in the afternoon to tell some story about the family. Well, what she had done was she put together this very comprehensive booklet of our family genealogy, the Hewlett family, the 5 children that were the start of the family, the slave, Bib Hanna, who was bought by Williams Carter Wickham in the late 1800s. I can't remember the year, but it was before the Civil War. She went to work on a plantation called Hickory Hill in Ashland, Virginia. And so there she is working on this plantation. Williams Carter Wickham had 5 children by Bib Hanna. I'm descended from the 3rd child, Felix. So Kay tells us this story. She also did a whole family history of the Wickhams. And then she also all of the sociology of the time and all kinds of, it was a really wonderful document. I took it home and I read it twice and I put it away. Traveling around, all of this is in my head, but quite frankly, it was just too much to process. And I really didn't know exactly what I would do with it. We get hired to come to Swananoa for a summer program, and we're teaching a course on the spirituals that week. And I remember on Wednesday of that week, we had planned the songs that we wanted to sing and teach, and we ran a little short. So in filling the time, I thought, well, maybe I'll kind of share a little personal history. And I mentioned in the class that I had this connection to Hickory Hill and to Richmond, Virginia. And one of the students, Franny Oates, came up after the class and she said, I grew up in Richmond, and one of my best girlfriends in high school was Lisa Wickham. She's got to be part of that family. And I said, well, she probably is. It's a pretty prominent family. She said, if I find her, I haven't talked to her in 30 years. Would you be interested in talking to her? I said, absolutely. 2 years go by, I get an email from from Fanny, and she says, I found Lisa. We had the most remarkable reunion, and she wants to talk to you. Long story short, I picked up the phone literally after 2 weeks because I didn't know what was on the other end of the phone with that conversation. We talked for 3 hours, and over the course of time, about 6 years ago, I went to Richmond. We had a reunion of cousins, and since that time, we've been in dialogue. Lisa, her brother George, her sister Wallace, and on occasion 5 years ago, we went to the plantation. It's still intact. It just got sold this year and is being divvied up. They're saving the house. They put a protective zone around the house. But we went and we walked the land of the plantation, and we talked about what that meant for us to be there. I subsequently wrote 2 songs about it. And I am now in conversation with not only the Wickham family and all of them, but also with a group called Coming to the Table. I'll be helping to lead a pilgrimage this fall for the group that I work with, the Living Legacy Project, that will be co-sponsored by the Coming to the Table, which is a group that gets people who have slave history, and slave-owning history together to dialogue. What I'll be doing is leading them on a pilgrimage of civil rights sites, and singing songs, talking about the Underground Railroad, talking about how that connects us to present history.
Reggie, when are you going to do the screenplay for that remarkable story?
It's on my agenda.
While we're talking about American history, I couldn't, and my segment of this is just about done, I couldn't let Pat get away without asking about songs that made America famous. I do sometimes play the one song you can play on the radio from that album, which is one more than on a Kendrick Lamar album. But how did you come to make that album, and did you expect folks to understand the satirical nature of it?
No, I expected them to be mad. I was inspired by Tom Lear. I don't know how many of you have heard him, but he wrote really outrageous songs. And
Poisoning Pigeons in the Park.
Poisoning Pigeons in the Park, and
National Brotherhood Week.
Hello, Mom, I'm off to drop the bomb.
the funny thing about it, it was Bob Fass had a show in New York. I don't know how many times I played. WBAI? I went in there with this album, and he said, well, we got to hear this. And he puts it down, puts a needle on, and then we just start talking and sort of forgot. And he didn't realize that the record was going out over the air. And he even got a call from the Archbishop of New York. And it was just pretty outrageous. Anyway, I didn't think about it. I did think that there weren't enough satirical songs in America. That's what we really need. And then that's what I thought I'd written. Then I had played the record for this friend of mine who's a professor at Georgia Tech, Bud Foote. Actually, he died, and he said, he listened to the record, and he said, you know, this is not satire, this is diatribe. So I started calling myself a diatribist to switch my career again. But that's basically it.
Well, now we come to the third segment where I turn the program over to our panelists. Doug, would you like to pose a query to either Pat or Reggie?
Well, both, actually. I might start with the fellow on my left here, since we're going to be seeing him in a few weeks at the Swannanoa Gathering. And he's going to be teaching a couple of courses, as Jim McGill, the director in the audience, well knows. One is Songs of Hope and Freedom, and Lord knows we need that today. And the second, Reggie, I think is something about using the old ballad, Ain't You Got the Right to the Tree of Life, which basically involves bringing the old songs back that have such a relevance today. You've kind of touched on this, but I think it's such a timely topic that I think all of us would appreciate you expanding on that a little bit. How these old songs are timeless and in some ways more relevant than ever.
Well, my idea of recapturing the songs, it's actually, I use the title Reclaiming. It's amazing to me that even in the African American community, a lot of the songs of the spirituals and the civil rights songs that have been such a marvelous resource for inspiration and for social and political action really aren't sung. The community itself has moved on, and I think this is true of American culture. We've become kind of disposable in our use of culture. So my mission over the course of some 20 years, and it really did actually start again with some of my time at Swan and Noah, of focusing on, I was teaching actually for a few years, I was teaching performance during the Songwriter Week. And I became aware of the fact that a lot of the folks who were coming in to write songs weren't really aware. They were kind of reinventing the wheel or kind of putting their spin on things that really, in so many cases, had already been thought out pretty completely. I'm not saying you have to sing those songs all the time, but drawing from, I draw so powerfully, and there are so many other artists who draw so powerfully from the root music. We call them roots now because we need a category, a genre to sell them. So my interest in this day and age is to write new songs and to add our personal take on that. But you have to understand where those things come from. So the course that I'm going to teach this year will be to look at some of those source material songs and then retranslate them in our own language, in our own time. And I just had a great conversation on the way in. One of the folks I've met this week, Tony, was saying that last night he sat with some of the young folks here for about 2 hours, and he loved their songwriting. And I think one of the things I encounter all the time is that I go into these communities and I play these old songs that have stood the test of time, and they inspire other writing, but they are not familiar songs in our American canon at this point. And I don't really want to lose that fabric. I understand that. I was singing on a small demonstration 2 weeks ago in our town. There was a Republican dinner, and our Republican representative who will not hold a town meeting was coming in. So we thought we'd greet him on the way in. And I was standing with our crowd of about 150, 200 people, and they were chanting and they were yelling and I just kind of looked around and I said, we need to be singing. And we had about 10 musicians there, and nobody had risen up in song yet. So I just started singing, and suddenly there we were. So that's what I'm looking at, reinvigorating the power of music to take to new places.
Thank you.
Reggie, do you have a question for Pat or Doug?
Actually, I think for both, but I want to frame, since both of you have a little bit more experience in terms of drawing from the power of the 60s. I was sort of on the cusp of that. But if you could talk about the relational pieces of your connections to artists in those times. I think the thing I know about the community, and from my interaction with the people I've gotten to either open for or become friends with, there was a fabric of inspiration that came just from the connections that you were making. And you mentioned sitting at the bar, that somebody would come by.
All right. And it was I guess it's sort of like a school in its own way. The core of us living there at the time was Eric Anderson and Phil Oakes and myself and Buffy and Peter LaFarge we'd do a song and I'd go play it for somebody and they'd say, well, you know, that line needs to change and this line needs to change. So it was a school in that way. That's sort of how I looked at it. I think the powerhouse that drove the songs at that time was the Vietnam War. You can't really get away from it. To show you what level it was on, you don't see any humor in the Vietnam War. Or if you look at the World War II, there's all kinds of funny stuff in songs. And that was sort of the beginning as the thing closed down in 75, started drifting away. And it seems to be coming back. That's what I like about being here. But I think in the last 5 to 6 or 10 years, the folk thing hit its low, I think, and it seems to be coming back. I know I've heard this before, but maybe this time it'll happen with some of these youngsters here. So I don't know whether that answers your question.
Well, how about you, Pat? Do you have a query for Reggie or Doug?
No, except for, do you have any wisdom for elders? I could give you one. I talked to an old man who lived to be 95, and I said, what's the secret of life? How do you live so long? And he says, there's a long silence, and he says, don't fall.
I asked Tommy Gerald one time what his secret to long life was, and he said, 3 times I went off to kill somebody, and I couldn't find them, and by the time I sobered up, I didn't want to kill them anymore.
Well, our Pat's answer suggests a question I wanted to ask him, because I've just been struck by how many times he has taken up a new phase in his life, reinvented himself, his work, his music. And in higher education and in all of education, there's a dynamic we try to be sensitive to, and that is it can be a burnout profession, and it can hit for public school teachers maybe at 5 years. I've seen it with faculty who halfway through their tenure kind of go on automatic pilot, and they've taught the same thing, said the same words over and over. And it's not just indigenous to education. It can occur in all professions. I'm sure many of you and many of us have experienced times in your life you said, how much more do I want to keep doing this? And how you reinvent yourself and enter a new phase and really recreate your life. Pat has done that so many times, from the Greenwich Village scene to being a singer, to being an instrumentalist, to discovering the Irish music and the roots, to being an instrument maker. And Pat, how did that come about you? Because your life lesson would be a good object lesson for a lot of folks who are trying to find a way to revitalize their professional life journey.
Well, I think for me it came about slowly. There was no great big pursuit of a career of anything. Some of the places were there, and I would just play them, you know. And when I'd get bored, I'd try to dig up something else, and that's why I did so many things.
So your boredom really allowed you to reinvigorate yourself rather than just keep sinking deeper into boredom, which is an inspiring story, certainly.
Yeah.
A creative boredom.
Rather than getting more bored.
Yeah. It's really funny. I think tagging on that, one of the features of, I think, you know, by nature, artists are inquisitive. I think that's I know that's one of the reasons why the Kennedy Center was so interested in our work. And we also did a lot of work with Sylvia Burdett over the course of years. The reason they approached Kim and I also in the 1980s was that they said they heard in our arrangements a fresh disregard for structure. And they were fascinated by that. They were even more fascinated by the fact that we couldn't always explain why we went there. But what that did was we created arrangements that, they said, we just quite frankly would never think of. The Kennedy Center embraced that because there's the whole idea of the evolutionary learning scale. that you plan a lesson, you do the lesson, you evaluate the lesson. From what you learn of the evaluated, then you take the next step and you do your next lesson, which is a spiral that continues to evolve. And I think in academics, that's what you're talking about. You never really settle on the things because you understand that there are things about what you've done. The reason that the arts are so important in that process is because they're the greatest example of how to express that. So if you have kids singing, if you have them doing visual arts, if you have them dancing, they're constantly learning, and it's a body memory that is happening. It's a body exploration. So it becomes an exciting process that you can feel the learning, as opposed to just You
know, Reggie, that reminds me of about the significance of the arts in our society. Of a favorite quote or story, some of you may be aware of the letters from President John Adams to his wife Abigail after he left the presidency. And there's a replica of, or the originals are in the Library of Congress. But one of those involved the arts, and that letter went something like this, and I'm paraphrasing in part. He said, I take courses and learn about war and politics so that my sons and daughters have the liberty to study commerce and navigation and agriculture and math and philosophy, so that their sons and daughters are able to study the arts and music and poetry. He was saying really that for our artes and education as a society, the arts are at the pinnacle, and we need to remind ourselves of that as arts is often the first thing eliminated in school budgets, isn't it? A real irony.
Yeah, when commerce becomes more important than culture, society dies, wrote a friend of mine at Columbia. As always, despite the best intentions, I have less time for audience questions than I intended, but now it is your turn to ask questions of our panel. Thomas?
I'd like to address Reggie in just a second, because you've obviously spent a lot of time in the historical aspect of African American music and the growth of it. There's always, to me, there's a disconnect in my mind. It's merely from lack of education or my own ignorance. But the strong influence of gospel music, but you have to realize that's Christian music. And there had to be a time when the Africans came from the various parts of Africa. They weren't Christians.
Mm-hmm.
So how did that transition happen? Or has anybody even really researched that?
Oh, yeah, they researched it. Yeah, there are many PhDs on that subject. Largely, the short answer is that there were some, largely people who were brought from Africa had their own tribal religions, and they had their own customs. There were some who were already evangelized by Islam, about 10%, 15%. But they landed here, and all of those peoples had all their things. So they began to really create their own cosmology and their own perspective. And they also had to recreate it because a lot of those religions were tied to the land. They're not there anymore. So short form, they heard these stories. The Christian scriptures were read to them, or they were encouraged to read them if they could read. And a powerful thing happened. They heard those stories and they said, oh, Moses, Egypt, slavery. They began to take those scriptures and create their own, basically it was the start of liberation theology, which is why in the spirituals they began to express those themes, because they were reminding themselves, first of all, that they were who they were. They were people. They were not slaves. They were people in slavery, which was the very powerful thing. So out of the spirituals then began to rise, the blues, the gospel. It really was the foundation. But they began to really create their own belief, their own belief system, incorporating, which was their, spontaneity of the music, which also made that possible. So that is why also you have the duality of message. And I've been doing a lot of work with Scott Ainsley recently, and he does a lot of talking about how the blues were also coded. You couldn't talk about the establishment. You could talk about your girlfriend. You could talk about, what Mr. So-and-so did to you, whatever. So the coding and the dual messages serve the purpose of being oppressed in the land and also expressing yourself. Did they embrace Christianity? Yes, because it was also a very hopeful thing. It wasn't that they were dismissing that aspect of the spirituality, but they were incorporating a whole nother level that the masters didn't necessarily know or appreciate when they found out that that was liberating them.
But the interesting thing, Reggie, is whether it was fiddle styles or spirituals, they would learn some things from their slave masters, have their own interpretation. For example, fiddle music, add their slide, blues, syncopated notes, and it would become part of the vernacular of Appalachian and American music.
Right.
In what's called a loop.
And the beauty of that,
Yeah.
that because you don't realize oppressed peoples, because people forget that, there were all these slaves, but there were all these poor white people
Yeah.
who were also oppressed. Yeah.
Yeah.
So those communities really appreciated each other if they, even though they're not represented in the American story.
Our dance calls, square dances, they came out of the African American community, not the white community.
Definitely not the French community.
Not the French either.
Which was a theory. That's not just a joke. Next question.
Dr. Orr, I first wanted to say that Wayfaring Strangers is a gorgeous book that should be on everyone's coffee table and read. Beautiful CDs and wonderful. I was curious, at what point in the process of writing and researching did you have or seek a publisher for it? Or were you affiliated with the university at that time?
Yeah, that's a good question. We knew that with Fiona's 250,000 listeners a week, we probably could get a major commercial publisher in New York to publish our book. And in fact, we went to New York and met with an agent. These days, to get a commercial publisher in New York, you can't go directly, unsolicited manuscript, to one of those publishers. You have to have an agent. We have a good friend in Asheville who has an agent. She's a best-selling author. So we met with this individual in New York. We combined that with our visit up to Hudson to Pete Seeger to spend a day with him. And then we began hearing stories about the commercial publishers in New York and how fickle that scene is and how they don't negotiate with you. They mandate to you in terms of graphics, title, whatever it might be. I had done some books with the University of North Carolina Press, which is one of the premier university presses in the country. So basically, we returned home, and we could have gone with Random House or one of the imprints, Ballantine, Penguin, whatever. But we decided to go with the university press because university presses like books that have legs, and that is, as you infer, stories that don't really date. Some commercial books, they give them 6 or 8 weeks, and if they're not on the bestseller list, move on. But university publishers sustain their marketing efforts, and in fact, they help us get a New York Times bestseller rating in a certain category for our book. So those of you who have a book in you, and I'm sure many do, including these two fellows on my left, think about university publishers because, as I say, our stories are stories that need to be sustained and not just be faddish. And consequently, we had a wonderful experience. Darcy here, who is the art editor, had a good negotiation back and forth with the graphics editor. That would have not happened, and I'm maybe oversimplifying, with a major commercial publisher who said to Darcy, here's the way it is, here's the cover, here's what you can have and not. But it was a give and take, and they won some of the discussions, and we won some. And I think, Darcy, you would agree with that, wouldn't you? Thanks for your questions. Good.
Next query.
Talk a little bit about that pyramid of education, and your grandparents studied this, and then the next generation so that your children may study art. What happens after that in that pyramid or that cycle?
Well, that would allow me to get in on my soapbox about the importance of the liberal arts. And it is a long story, but in my opinion, having been president of a liberal arts college, that liberal arts are more relevant than ever today, with critical thinking, communication, synthesis of knowledge, respect for the past, because technical skills and jobs change in a year or two or less. And in a way, that pyramid with the arts at the top, the arts are where I think liberate the soul to really indulge in so much of learning. And we've had conversations with students, for example, who want to go immediately to art school or singing skills or whatever it might be. And we say the wellspring for that creativity really is the liberal arts. So knowing your history, knowing your classics, knowing about communications. Because how are you possibly going to write a song about the Underground Railway or hope or freedom without knowing the context? Do you agree, Reggie?
Oh, absolutely. I spent a week in East Texas at a Christian college, Jarvis Christian College, and the first question on the first day was, knowing the civil rights movement, what can you tell us about the foundational stories of the civil rights movement? 90% of the students had no idea. 12 years of schooling didn't introduce them to any of the concepts. So instead of spending a week talking about where we are, it was the week of the election. And we wanted to have conversations about the arts and the impact of the arts on present culture, and we couldn't even go there because they had no idea of how the foundational stories and the foundational songs and stories, as they rose out of the civil rights movement, what the connective tissue was. So we spent a week there talking about the foundational stories and introducing them to ground level. So.
Have you noticed how much easier it is to learn a foreign language if you know the context of the language and the culture rather than just memorizing vocabulary? It's kind of an analogy to that. Good question, thank you. And there's probably a better and longer answer, but it's such a fundamentally important question these days in our society. Thank you for that.
Next. Well, all right then. Thanks for being here for Wisdom of the Elders. Thanks for Alan Watts back on the board. And thanks to Kathy Sky for being up here. And a special thanks to our panelists, Doug Orr, Reggie Harris, Pat Sky.